Hello and a very warm welcome. You're watching an India Today CII Mega Budget Roundtable. Usually we're in one place all around a massive real roundtable. This will be a virtual roundtable, but that's also in keeping with the fact that we're dealing with a pandemic, which is also what Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman had to deal with while presenting the union budget for the coming fiscal. To what extent has she been able to focus very sharply the government's spending priorities? Is this the maximum bang for the buck that we could have got? And to what extent does this help the Indian economy bounce back? Does it speed up the process of recovery? To talk about this, we're joined by a very distinguished panel. I want to start introducing you to our guests joining us for this hour of programming, starting with TV Narendran. He's the President Designate of CII, Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director of Tata Steel. With us on this broadcast is Baba Kalyani, Chairperson and Managing Director of Bharat Forge. A lot of emphasis on Atmanirbhar Bharat, a lot of emphasis on Make in India for all sectors, including in the defense sector. Chandrajit Banerjee is the Director General of the Confederation of Indian Industry. With us for a perspective from the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party, its most articulate economic spokesperson, Jayant Sinha. Squaring off against him from the Congress Party, Member of Parliament from Thiruvananthapuram, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. I want to go across to Jayant Sinha first to lay out why you believe this budget provides the best bang for the buck. For every rupee announcement that's been made in terms of government spending, why do you believe that the announcements and the vision laid out by the Finance Minister is what the Indian economy required to get back on its feet after the recession, after the pandemic, as quickly as possible? Let's start with Jayant Sinha.
Rahul, this is an outstanding budget because it has provided booster rockets for the economy. The Honorable Prime Minister, of course, rolled out the vaccination program, which is going to restore us back to normal health. And what the Honorable Finance Minister has done with the budget is to provide the booster rockets for the economy in parallel. So with both lives and livelihoods taken care of, I think not only are we going to get a V-shaped recovery, but as I have written, I think we are going to advance towards the roaring 20s. Because even as India is going to grow very rapidly now, please understand that globally there's tremendous both monetary and fiscal stimulus as well. So with a very, very positive global environment, very positive drivers domestically, I think we're going to see many years of really outstanding growth. There are 3 or 4 factors in this budget that I think everybody should note. Number one, fiscal spending has been dramatically increased. Obviously 9.5% fiscal deficit this current financial year, but 6.8% in the next financial year, about 35 lakh crores worth of spending, and a massive increase in capital expenditure as part of this. So tremendous boost as far as fiscal resources are concerned, massive fiscal expansion, very important to note. Second important point to note is that taxes have virtually not gone up. Certainly direct taxes have not gone up at all. In fact, there have been a lot of improvements as far as compliance and ease of doing business is concerned. I think that's going to stimulate investment, and that's going to be really, really good for people's animal spirits and get them to go out and spend. Number 3, there are some very important reform announcements in this budget. There is, in fact, going to be a major move on strategic disinvestment. There is a ARC being set up to take care of NPAs. We are going to be increasing defense expenditure dramatically and bringing in a lot of defense spending through both domestic and foreign partners. These are all very major reform steps that have been taken. And then the final point I will make is that where we really need to concentrate our spending, which is in agriculture, so that we can lift the vast majority of Indians who are still in agriculture, that has been dramatically increased by the Agriculture Infrastructure Development Fund, by the money that's being doled out through the MSP and through the procurement process. So these are the 3-4 key points that I think make it absolutely clear that this budget has put on these booster rockets, and you can see that in the reaction of the stock markets, which of course have gone up 5 or 6% today already. So an outstanding budget. Everybody said, let's go to drive fiscal stimulus.
Dr. Shashi Tharoor, the opposition and the Congress calling this an underwhelming budget. Can you lay out at the outset your opposition to the announcements by the Finance Minister and why you don't share the sense of enthusiasm and optimism that Jayant Sinha laid out over the past 2 minutes?
Because unfortunately this government has a track record for very grand announcements which are not actually matched by either actual look at the numbers or by implementation. A classic example is indeed the one that Jan just mentioned. The finance minister claimed a 27 lakh crore stimulus under the various Atmanirbhar Bharat schemes. But we know that the direct fiscal impact of the earlier 20 lakh promise was exactly 2 lakh crores, which was 1% of GDP and not the 13% she's talking about. I find, for example, that if you look at the numbers, for example, the key issue is the one of health. There's this whole talk about 137% increase in the budget outlay for health. But in fact, unfortunately, if you look at the details that she's guided us towards in her speech, 35,000 crores are just for COVID vaccinations, which is a one-time investment. And 60,000 crores actually goes to the Department of Drinking Water and Sanitation. So the actual allocation under health and family welfare of 71,000 crores is barely a 10% increase from the previous allocation. So there's always a lot of hype. And the problem with this hype is, when is it going to be matched with actual implementation? I said when I came out of Parliament that, I really think this is like the garage mechanic who says to a client, I couldn't fix your bricks, so I made the horn louder. I mean, here you've got a very loud horn blaring about the achievements and intentions of the government, but the economy has been sliding downhill under its watch. And I find astonishing that even the few things that actually were working have been neglected. For example, the speech completely failed to refer to Mahatma Gandhi in Rega, whereas it's vital at a time of crisis to offer further fiscal support for the scheme. Instead, it turns out that their outlay has registered a 35% fall at a time when in December and January, demand for employment under NREGA has never been higher. And the failure to meet that demand, that they're given only about 60% of the requests have received jobs, people are still dependent on NREGA to recover from the financial and economic shocks they've gone through in the last year. And the high rates of demand for employment compared to the government cutting 35% shows you the disconnect between the government's policies and decisions and the needs of the country. A couple more quick points, Rahul. Defense, we have a border crisis with China, has only gone up by 7.4%. I'm truly surprised when, as recently as last year, the Parliamentary Committee on Defense actually demanded that allocations for modernization of defense need to be about 35% just in order to prepare for the current threats of last year. I mean, now we've had 20 of our Jawans being killed in Ladakh. The government just carries on business as usual, no money for defense. And I finally do want to point out that if you look in very practical terms at what this government has tried to do for us, capital expenditure, one can welcome. I hope it really is spent. But the larger issue is giving stimuluses so far to industry on the supply side has not resulted in significant new investments. I'm looking forward to hearing from the businessman on your
Okay, so let's start with TV Narendran and get his sense on...
Sorry, just to say that we need money in the hands of the ordinary public so demand can go up, and that has not been provided.
The government had so far said we are holding back our spending power so that when the economy starts accelerating, we're not pressing the accelerator and the brake at the same time. Through increases in allocations for infrastructure, roadways, railways, they're trying to ensure that. To what extent do you believe these budget announcements will have a multiplier effect, which will have a positive role on companies such as yours, and thereby help the economy revive faster? Mr. Narendran.
Because infrastructure has a multiplier effect. It takes money to the common man in many ways, because a lot of infrastructure is done by MSMEs, by smaller contractors. It's done across the country. It's not just urban-centric, it's rural-centric as well. So it ensures that the money flows to all parts of the economy. Secondly, it helps industry from a competitiveness point of view, because a lot of the costs that we incur are outside the factory gates. We can drive competitiveness inside the factory gates, but we depend on the governments, both state and center, to help us improve our competitiveness outside the factory gates. From an investment point of view, yes, private sector investment has not been so great over the last few years, but we must recognize that even before the pandemic, the economic activity was a bit slow. So demand was not so great, and profitability was also not so great for many companies. And on top of that, you had a liquidity crisis before the pandemic because of the NBFC situation. So as a consequence, companies are trying to deleverage, and the reduction in corporate tax rates really helped, but then the pandemic happened. So I think if the demand continues the way it has been for the last quarter or so, and continues this year, stimulated by the spend on infrastructure, then you will see the demand continue to grow and hopefully the profitability improving and the health of the balance sheets also looking better and investments coming back. I think if I look at the industry I represent, steel, I think we have been one of the biggest investors over the last 5-10 years in creating manufacturing facilities in India. And I think that will continue to happen given the state of the economy just now.
Chandrajit Banerjee, you speak to a cross-section of Indian industry. How far are you from that crucial inflection point where current capacities are adequately realized and corporate India has the appetite, the wherewithal, the ambition and the confidence to go out and start making new investments? And to what extent does the budget spur that?
One of the things that we have been saying just before the budget, Rahul, was that we would really look forward to a stable interest rate, and importantly connected to the budget, we were saying we were looking at a stable taxation, which was going to be important for investors to bounce back and animal spirits to come in. We have said that as soon as capacity utilization reaches about 75%, industry will plan investment provided the tax regime remains stable. And one of the things that we have seen in the budget is keeping the tax regime stable. Second, one very important point is, many of the sectors which Naren was mentioned in the last quarter or so or more, many sectors have started looking up. Automobiles, say for instance, that there's a big boost to the automobile sector, the scrappage policy, or the buses that you have heard about, the PPP, more needs to be found out on that. But that itself is a big booster. Second, we also see, a lot of impetus being given to the private sector investments coming in. You see already the mineral-based industry is doing well. We see the capital goods industry doing well in the last few months. We also see a good amount of positive growth in sectors like the machine tools, etc. So I see that with the stability that we have seen in the budget, and especially through the financial sector reform, a big step which has been taken, and with the infrastructure boost, I don't see a difficulty for capacity utilization to expand over some point in time. And surely I see this kicking in the second half, by the second half of the year, very strongly.
Baba Kalyani, once again in the budget, and I want to show that to our viewers, in this word cloud that we've put together based on the Finance Minister's speech this time round, one of the key thrusts was the idea of Atmanirbhar Bharat, which was a phrase used by the Finance Minister 14 times in this budget, one of the most often used words. To what extent do you believe this budget has the policy incentives to turn the idea of Atmanirbhar Bharat into a living reality?
Well, Rahul, I think, first of all, we have to congratulate the Finance Minister and her team for putting an outstanding budget, an outstanding idea for a confident India going forward, for an Atmanirbhar India going forward. A lot of things that were not explicitly stated in the budgets have already been stated right from May 2020 till the budget time, including, let's say, the defense production policies, which was stated in May 2020, the PLI schemes that have been stated. And I think what comes out from this budget is that this is a confident India that is going to face the future in a very confident manner. And let me just give you 2 or 3 points that I feel personally on this. First, I think in terms of taxation, there has not been any change or increase in taxation. Large expenditure on infrastructure, financed largely by asset monetization and disinvestments and borrowings. That's a brave India going forward for growth, and growth not just for this year, not just to get back to pre-COVID levels, but growth to go much beyond pre-COVID levels. And I think what this is going to do, at least to our sector in the manufacturing scenario, is give a lot of confidence to start making investments for the future. There's a huge opportunity for India to again start becoming a major manufacturing nation. I think the last 2-3 years were very difficult. Even a year before COVID, the manufacturing sector was already going down. Of course, COVID put brakes all around the world. But I think this budget and the expressions of getting India back on its feet, getting the manufacturing sector back on its feet, and not only just back on its feet, but making it start expanding, start investing in the future.
Okay.
I think this will start happening.
So, Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw, the healthcare sector getting pride of place in the allocations made by the Finance Minister, which in any case was imperative because of the fact that we're in the middle of a raging pandemic. What do you think this suggests about healthcare spending going forward? What are you making of the manner in which the Finance Minister said she wants to spend this extra funding? And to what extent does helping the healthcare sector improve its own health help the health of the Indian economy? Kiran Shaw.
So I think it's a very important step. As you know, the whole world has realized that it has underinvested in healthcare, and India is no exception. So getting, this focus on healthcare is extremely important. And the fact that we are going to be allocating 136% extra this fiscal is a step in the absolute right direction. Having said that, of course, we are seeing that most of the spend is actually coming from vaccine procurement, which is 35,000 crores, and 64,000 crores by way of investing in strengthening our primary, secondary, and tertiary care system in the public healthcare domains, which I think is extremely important. Having said that, I also want to emphasize that just spending money on COVID vaccines is not really good enough. I think we need to spend on life-saving medicines, on other kinds of, drugs like TB drugs and, other vaccines as well. So I think that 35,000 crores being only focused on COVID is essential, but I think we need to go beyond that. Secondly, I'm also wanting to refer to the investment in research and innovation. As you know, Rahul, the private sector research ecosystem is the one that actually came out with the vaccines, the medicines, and the diagnostics. Had it not been for the private sector who came to the fore, I don't think we would have managed the pandemic this well. So there needs to be a recognition that just investing in public sector research and innovation is not the answer. I think allocating this 50,000 crores over the next 5 years for research and innovation only in the public sector is not ideal. It has to straddle the private and public ecosystem. So I would like to see that, sort of aspiration and indication of how they are going to look at the private sector when it comes to the healthcare sector, when it comes to the pharma sector, in terms of research and innovation.
So, Jayant Sinha, can I get you to respond to the criticism laid out by Shashi Tharoor when he was responding to you? He drew an analogy of, how you're fixing the horn when the brakes were what needed to be fixed. And you spoke of how the fiscal deficit would be at 9.5%, signaling the government's desire to spend. The reality is that the sharp spurt in over the 6 to 7%, which was the budget expectation, is because what was earlier off budget for expenditure like the Food Corporation of India has now been brought into the budget. So this is already money which the government was spending in any case, was spending it earlier off budget. Now you're acknowledging the spend. So you're cleaning up the books in it, were not necessarily suggesting those many more enhanced spends. Jayant Sinha.
That's not true, Rahul, and very clearly we have delivered on the ground. It's not just a question of hype. This is a question of what the reality is for a person, let's say in Hazaribagh, in my constituency, in Jharkhand, Uttar Pradesh, all of the underdeveloped areas of the country, where now we can give them a pakka ghar, we can give them a pakka sadak, bijli, pani, we can give them a toilet, we can give them a gas cylinder. All of these basic necessities that they did not have been delivered to them over the last 5 or 6 years. Obviously, Congress governments before us could not do this. We have done this in very, very short period of time. And those are real results on the ground that people are experiencing. And you just have to look around you to see the highways that have been built, the airports that have been built, the metros that have been built, to realize that when we talk about the national infrastructure pipeline, we talk about all this infrastructure investment, that these are very real assets that are being built for the benefit of India. And that brings me to a big philosophical difference between the way the Congress and Shashi ji think about how to move the economy forward and how we think about moving the economy forward. While there is talk of putting money into the bank accounts of people, we've obviously done that, we've obviously created bank accounts. We want to at the same time, even while we are providing that necessary support, we at the same time want to ensure that we are not just providing money into people's bank accounts, but we are actually giving them a high quality job. And if you ask anyone or any young person in India what they really want, is it's a high quality job with the right benefits, pension, healthcare, all of these other benefits as well. And if you look at what we're doing with respect to infrastructure spending, healthcare spending, social sector spending, we are in fact creating those jobs. There is an announcement of a mega textile park, the Mitra initiative, that's going to create lakhs of jobs as well. So our focus is jobs, because those are the things that give dignity and they enable people in the long run to lead much more prosperous and better lives.
Okay.
And that is the philosophical difference between the way the Congress thinks about what to do about spending and the way we think about spending.
Dr. Tharoor, you can always quibble about what the government didn't do, but the reality is by concentrating its spending on infrastructure projects, roadways, highways, helping healthcare in the middle of a pandemic, the government is really focusing its energy where it believes the maximum multiplier effect lies, the maximum creation of jobs, pumping up demand in other companies, for example, Tata Steel and many others. And that, which is a much better way of trying to get the economy back on track than to just give out doles, which is easy, convenient, sounds politically the right thing to do. But this at least has a positive multiplier effect for the economy, Dr. Tharoor.
And so does improving the demand capacity of the Indian consumer. Putting money in the hands of ordinary people is also a way of giving them the means to spend. If you just give them money, unfortunately, in terms of supply side credit liquidity easing, you're not going to necessarily put that money to work in the economy. But I do want to say, Rahul, that I'd like to be, as an Indian, I'd like to believe Jayant's positive spin. I really want this country to do well. We all do. So let's not get that wrong. My concern is whether we have, in fact, been sold a bill of goods. If you look at the precise examples I gave you, the gap between what is said and the actual reality, like the 137% hype in health infrastructure, as Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw pointed out, it's actually not. It's mainly going into vaccines. I mean, the essential issue we've got to address is where is the real improvement? We do need to create jobs, but jobs will be created in the infrastructure sector that money is spent. I've been a consistent supporter of government expenditure on infrastructure, back Mr. Gadkari's work, and if that is going to give us more jobs in that sector, wonderful. But there are a lot of other sectors where there still isn't enough money in people's hands to buy the goods that might be produced. There is no real tax relief for the salaried class here. And when we talk about the government generating money out of privatization, we know that every one of their 6 years they've had a target, every one of their 6 years they've failed, except the one time when they got one set of public sector enterprises to buy shares in another, and they showed that as disinvestment. So they've got a lot of unrealistic numbers here.
The government has announced that they will be privatizing 2 public sector banks, which is what a lot of people, economists, corporates, had been asking for. But Shashi Tharoor is bang on that the Modi government's track record on disinvestment so far doesn't inspire much confidence. How convinced are you that the not so ambitious in comparison to the last year disinvestment target laid out this year and the announcement that public sector banks and one general insurance company will be privatized will actually be followed through and will see the light of day?
See, Rahul, this entire issue of disinvestment is something which is not new. We have been talking about it for a long time, and we have seen action, we have seen non-action, we have seen. So I would really like to say, look at with the boldness with which the government has gone ahead. This is a pretty bold government from that point of view. I think there are a number of reforms announced in the financial sector, including plus, you talked about the bank privatization, including the IDBI bank, which is very, very important. I think there is a strong commitment. Yes, of course, implementation is important. I would look forward to the implementation because at this point in time, that the government spending is so strong. There is a fiscal deficit which we have projected this year and going forward for the next year and the year after that. So obviously the government would need some of these to be completely well implemented. And I think so there is when there is a need, when there is obviously I would see implementation also taking place. So I'm pretty not just hopeful, but I see this to be something where...
No, but what are you basing the hope on? Because the fact is, Jay and Sinha, everybody would like these disinvestment announcements to go through, but Shashi Tharoor is absolutely right. Look at your own government's track records, compare what gets announced in the budget with what happens in the year that follows. So far, this government hasn't done enough to convince right-minded people who are unbiased, objective, that it actually intends to follow through on these announcements. If it hasn't happened in the last 6 years, what's the guarantee it will happen this year? Jay and Sinha.
Rahul, we've shown the intent that we want to undertake strategic disinvestment, and this time the Honorable Finance Minister has clearly said we want to privatize 2 public sector banks and a general insurance company. We've already begun the process associated with LIC. So as exactly as Chandrajit said, we have been very bold in this regard. We have a cabinet policy on disinvestment right now. And of course, the markets also have to cooperate. Right now, the markets are doing well. And so we can be hopeful that these numbers will be realized. But every time you want to do a disinvestment, and having gone through the whole Air India process, Rahul, I can tell you that you not only have to have a seller, you also have to have a buyer as well. And finding those buyers so that you can have a robust disinvestment process, so that full value is realized and you can take care of all of the other issues associated with the disinvestment process, requires both the seller as well as a good pool of buyers as well. And that's why you have to look at market conditions and recognize when is it possible to do these kinds of large-scale disinvestments and when it's not possible to. And so we've obviously had to deal with a number of circumstances. Of course, we had LIC and we had Air India and all of that queued up for this year. And then we ran into the coronavirus global pandemic, which really made it not at all possible for us to do those disinvestments. So you have to take into account the circumstances also during which the disinvestment process is being undertaken. That said, if you look at what the government is intending to do, what the government's policies are, what our intent is, that we have been crystal clear, and those have been bolder, more aggressive and more far-reaching than any government in India's history has ever attempted.
No, so to what extent, Ms. Narendran, do you buy the intent, and do you think that intent is good enough to carry the government through, or do you think it's about high time? Because last year, you can still give the government some concession. They were dealing with a global pandemic, which is unprecedented. But now with the markets also doing well, if they can't push through these disinvestments, then we can just come to the conclusion that they're not serious. They say it, but they don't have the wherewithal. And I say this in the context of the protests that the farm laws have seen. A big political backlash. Do you think that could at some level, subdue the government's desire to go in for big ticket reform or big bold disinvestment projects, which may come in for some criticism? A public sector bank is not easy to divest. There will be the unions, there'll be others jumping in, trying to scuttle the project and the bids.
I think the intent is there, the opportunity is there because the markets are strong. There's a lot of liquidity in the global markets, which is looking for good investment opportunities. But obviously, it has to be navigated well. I think that's what you're alluding to. I also think the part of the speech which talked about monetization of government assets also needs to be looked at seriously, because I think there's a lot of opportunity there beyond disinvestment, and that's something that can be, to my mind, more easily done. And if the government focus is there, then the revenues can come from there as well. Because otherwise, there is going to be a bigger hole in the budget than has been forecasted, because the fiscal deficit is already high, and we depend a lot on the revenues that to come from the divestments.
Okay, Baba Kalyani, what would be the appetite in your view if the government was serious about, and I'm not specifically saying about your company, but just your sense of the appetite in India Inc. to want to try and pick up some of the assets that may be on the table if the government were to actually try and push this through? Because Jayant Sinha was in the Civil Aviation Ministry as they were trying to push through the original bid of Air India. That didn't go through for various reasons. Even if it's a more cleaned out deal, do you think there's greater appetite now?
I think there is, first of all, there is a large supply of money in the capital markets around the world. There are many hedge funds, PE funds, investors who are willing to come in and join hands with Indian businesses to buy assets which they are interested in. So, if at all this has to be done and succeed, this is the right time. And I think there is reasonable appetite. I think what we need to do is to have a process that is reasonably transparent and reasonably speedy.
Okay, you're calling for a speedy and transparent process, but Chandrajit Banerjee, this government is dealing with the political aftermath of the Land Reform Acts, and that makes me wonder about the actual appetite to push something through which may be economically desirable but politically suboptimal.
One thing which I just wanted to mention in this discussion, and Dr. Sinha also mentioned it, the budget really talks about privatization, not just disinvestment of the PSBs or the public sector banks is concerned. And it's not a market action. Can't comment on the past since privatization has not been done earlier. We are talking about privatization, and it's not a market. It's not a market action. So you have a buyer, go ahead with it.
Okay, you have a buyer, you go ahead with it, provided that the buyer feels confident in wanting to go ahead and make the purchase. Shashi Tharoor is nodding his head, he wants to come and see. Can past performance, but the desperation is higher. You can look at past performance, that's the glass that's half full. The glass that's half, the glass that's half empty, the glass that's half full is that they really need to mobilize revenue. They've been priming themselves for it. So maybe this is the year when the government will deliver, Dr. Tharoor.
Rahul, very simply, it's just that they've got a disinvestment target of 1.75 lakh crores. And the truth is, as Jayant himself said, you've got to find a buyer. If you don't find buyers, you don't have that money. And that's 1.75 lakh crores out of their expenditure calculations, because that's money that won't be coming in unless they find these buyers. Now, I hope Mr. Narendra's right, and there's lots of liquidity in the global market, and people are tripping over themselves to buy Air India. But, I'll believe it when it happens. And the truth is that there are some genuine challenges we have been facing in unloading a lot of the stuff the government's wanted to unload. That's my point.
So let Jayant Sinha respond to this. Let Jayant Sinha respond to the point that Shashi Tharoor makes. And let's take Air India, a deal which you've studied. You worked on deals in the past. You worked on this deal. You were unsuccessful. Now, the current offer is different from what was offered previously. But the reality is, current players already suffering, the likes of Indigo, the likes of the Tata Group, the likes of SpiceJet already bleeding. And when current operators are bleeding, what's the appetite they will have, whether it's them or someone on the outside, to want to come in and pick up a loss-making company? Jayant Sinha?
Investors look to the future, Rahul. And if you look at aviation in India, can you hear me, Rahul?
I hear you well.
So I was saying that investors and companies always look to the future. And if you look at aviation in India, it has a very bright future. And I think that's why people will be interested in Air India with the right terms and conditions, which I think that the current offering absolutely has the right terms and conditions now. And so I'm very hopeful that Air India will, in fact, get disinvested this time.
Let me put you on the spot and ask you this question.
Well. And
two public sector banks are to be privatized, Jayant Sinha. Which two public sector banks do you think are best suited to be sold off to a private player at this time? Because the choice of the two banks also will reveal a lot about the government's intent. Does it pick successful, high-ranking PSBs? Does it pick something in the middle? Does it pick a weak bank? If it picks a weak bank, nobody comes, or fewer people are interested. Therefore, which banks do you think the government should be picking to send out the right signal that it is serious? This is not jiggery pokery trying to make up the numbers, but they're actually serious about getting away from doing business which they have no business being.
So Rahul, there's going to have to be a comprehensive process to make that decision, and there are many factors that will come into play. Those factors will have to be considered. So I simply can't say what those banks are going to be. It depends a lot on how the process unfolds. But I think it's very, very clear that, like we said with LIC last time, and we're saying with the public sector banks this time, that we're going to undertake all of the difficult work that's required to prepare a public sector undertaking for disinvestment. This requires stripping out the non-core assets, getting the level of debt right, getting the terms and conditions on other liabilities such as whatever payments you have, whatever lawsuits you're involved in, how to take care of workers. There are a whole host of issues that you have to work through. But because we have shown again and again that we are determined to do that, we are undertaking all of the sort of legislative changes that are necessary for LIC and for the banks to make it happen. And those are really the steps that are required to implement it and make these bold initiatives happen. And as I said, if it had not been for the pandemic last year, we would have been much further along, both with LIC as well as with Air India and others as well, including, for example, the Container Corporation of India.
I have time only for one last question.
We are very determined to do it. It's not a simple task, and we are determined to get it done.
To Kiran Shaw, 35,000 crore rupees set aside by the Finance Minister for the vaccine project. In the coming fiscal, what extent of the Indian population do you think would get vaccinated with this kind of an outlay, and given what we've seen over the past few weeks when this vaccination project has been rolled out, and to what extent will that be enough to get the economy back on track as close to the old normal that we were used to? Kiran Shaw.
So I think we need to basically vaccinate at least half the population in the shortest possible time. And I personally believe that the private sector has to be roped in if we want to do it expeditiously. And I think the private sector can also play a strong role in getting the general public, vaccinated along with the priority population, because I believe that this is about both protection and prevention of transmission. And I think that's the way we ought to roll out vaccination.
Okay, I'd leave it over there. Kiran Mazumdar Shaw, Shashi Tharoor, Baba Kalyani, Chandrajit Banerjee, TV Narendran and Jayan Sinha for joining us on this special broadcast. Thank you very much. We'll slip into a break. Our coverage of the union budget for 2021-22 continues unabated on the other side of a very quick break. Stay with us.